Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining the session today. I'm here once again, Ahmad Javaid. I'm the CEO of Cytellite. Once again, we brought yet another episode of Technovation with Ahmad Javaid with very relevant and important topics like one today. Today, we will be discussing about how we're going to navigate into the digital privacy landscape globally, regionally, and locally, and as well as a very important aspect of emerging technologies, which is AI governance. And today I'm joined with the very legendary heavyweight champions of the industry, which I feel privileged to moderate the session with and having a discussion. And definitely, I can assure the audience today that there's a lot to take away from this session. So please do not miss any part of this session. And this transmission is being streamed on YouTube and LinkedIn as well, so where you can leave your questions, and we will towards the end of the session, we will get our try our level best to collect and respond as many questions as we can. So in case, due to the time pressure elements, if we are not been able to answer any question, don't don't feel bad, and it will be responded later on the comments section on the YouTube video recorded, which will be uploaded on the CxO Global Forum channel. So without any further ado, I would like to invite my special guests, heavyweight champions of the privacy world, and starting from Tahir, Latif, if you kindly introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tahir Latif. Thank you, Ahmad Bhai, for inviting us all. I have a long career in data privacy, both client side and very long career in consultancy. I'm now an expert advisor to C-suite and to regulators across the globe.
Pleasure to have you, sir, here with us, and definitely we will be learning a lot from your experience and the knowledge and wisdom. So moving towards our next guest, Mr. Imran Chowdhury, if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. I'm honored to be here today in this critical intersection of digital privacy and AI governance, a topic that is not only globally significant, but also has a very much significant in the dynamic landscape of GCC and Qatar. My role as a global data protection officer for one of the major multinational media organization, Al Jazeera, it is something that my responsibility spans across these areas of privacy and AI and digital transformation efforts in a secure, compliant, and ethically sound manner is very much relevant to this particular topic, and it is my pleasure to join this team panel.
Indeed, pleasure is all ours. So thank you so much, Imran Chowdhury, for joining us today. And I'll move to our last guest for today, Mr. Daniel Patterson, if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for inviting me here today, and welcome to everybody who's joined us from around the world. And what an amazing panel of experts this is today. So I'm Daniel Patterson. I'm the Data Protection Commissioner here with the Qatar Financial Center in Qatar, which is its own special jurisdiction within the state of Qatar, and we have our own data privacy law. So and my role is to oversee compliance as well as educate, inform, and then enforce that regulations here in Qatar. Been doing it for about 6 years, but historically I've worked in risk and compliance for over 20 years now, focusing mostly in financial services, in banks, insurance companies. So I have a lot of practical experience. I've been a DPO before I was a regulator, so at least I think I know both sides, the pain of trying to comply, but also the how to ultimately enforce. And I also just need to make it clear that I'm giving my own personal views today. These aren't necessarily the views of the QFC. But it's just absolutely great to be here with all of you today.
It's all pleasure to have you, sir, here with us. So, considering the recent technological evolution and the inclusion of AI adoption with the high pace, which has started impacting the way we live, interact, and collaborate today. Of course, there is a significance of managing managing and handling the data more and more safer way, where definitely our expert panelists today will be sharing their insights and comments and knowledge and experience, where of course your experience here today on this panel is I would, if I myself, if I try to weigh the amount of experience we have on this panel, is more than a century. So you will definitely have a very strong takeaways from this discussion today. So without any further ado, I would start the discussion by asking my very first question to Imran Chowdhury, that if how do you see the current global regulatory landscape evolving around AI and digital privacy, particularly with the European Union AI Act release and the other frameworks?
It's a very relevant question. Thank you, Ahmed. The global regulatory landscape for both AI and digital privacy is evolving at a rapid pace. It is driven by the need to balance innovation with certain ethical standards and protection of personal data. Now, why did it really come about? If we really look at it, is that about 100 years ago or so, before the digital revolution really started to happen, we have protection, privacy protection, but mostly in the areas of physical protection, our area, that is the protection around our surrounding, or which is our home, and also communication protection in the way of mail and exchanges that we used to do. But with the digital protection, the personal data protection became a big part, and that's what we started to see with the usage of the computer first. The information starts to go on digital platform where copying and information became very easy, and then our whole life with the mobile phone and social media, our every aspect of our life became part of this digital ecosystem, where we really do not have much control about where our data is, how our data is going to be used. And with the technical advancement of the big data, and then now the AI with the LLM and as such, the level of control an individual can really exercise has diminished significantly. And when that actually happened, you need certain regulations, certain parameters to really govern that, to ensure that the protection of the personal data and the privacy is maintained. And that is where you see a lot of these regulations is driven by, even significantly on the AI regulation is driven by the protection of the personal information, or how the ethically the data is going to be used in the AI system. And this is an example of such a regulation that we saw in the privacy protection. The GDPR came in 2016 with the effective date of 2018. A major impact of that regulation happened globally, and the GDPR became a gold standard across the world, where other countries started to adopt such a standard. AI snuck in through that with the GDPR. It is actually snuck in the terms of technology. Evolution of the technology happens too rapidly, and as such, what we see is that European Union responded with the EU AI Act, where GDPR took a longer time on the European Parliament to go through. AI Act did not take as long in terms of passing that particular regulation. But what we see is that that act is now being used more and less as standards across the world to say, hey, this is how we might want to look at it. Now, before Trump annulled all the executive order, we also saw that US followed a similar approach, but on a principle-based approach on an executive order, to establish certain AI regulatory framework around for the federal government. But what we also see is a similar regulation also exists in other countries who has adopted these regulatory principles. We also see OECD, for example, a global organization of the countries which also have adopted certain policy, AI policy, and United Nations also have facilitated certain dialogue to establish common principle, and that can serve as a bridging across the different countries, different regulatory regimes. This cross-border collaboration is essential given the inherently digital, global nature of this digital technology and the AI technologies, because the data is no longer just sitting in one jurisdiction, one regulatory areas. The data is, especially with the cloud, data is basically and apps. Data are moving all across, and we, using the mobile phone or our apps, we are giving permission and we are allowing companies and processors to take that data and store it all over the world. So this basically an area requires a global addressing of the global unified approach, possibly in the areas. But we see also there is certain interest in different countries, like US may have a different interest than China in the way of handling the data and in the way of this technology. So we might see a disagreement, but overall we see through OECD and United Nations, dialogue started to happen in terms of creating a common principles about how to use this AI technology. Focusing on the GCC and Qatar in particular, there is a clear movement towards integrating these international standards with local priorities. Qatar is advancing its digital infrastructure and smart city initiatives, making it critical case study in aligning robust privacy and security framework with innovation technologies. In that regard, we also see Qatar data policy and Qatar data standards, for example, was published recently, which is providing a guidelines for the organizations to follow to comply not just with the Qatari framework, but also a global framework and global standards like what we see, whether it's coming from the NIST or whether it's coming from the ISO, a goal towards unifying this framework.
Right.
So that's how I'll basically address it.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for painting the global landscape. Though, and definitely, like, we're gonna have a more detailed discussions in the context of our regional landscape, and in particularly the local Qatari landscape as well. So, Tahir, if I would ask the next question to you about contextualizing our discussion in the Middle Eastern perspective, that Middle East market has been rapidly advancing in AI adoption, and especially like fintech and other use cases of AI. So how are the regulators balancing innovation with privacy and governance concerning the Middle East related challenges?
Thank you. It's certainly a very balanced approach. It's not overly regulated. It's I think the Middle East has taken the approach that AI has a huge upside. So as a result of that, and as Imran has said, they've adopted certain principles and guidelines. So they haven't gone down the regulatory route in the Middle East at all. Certainly not to my knowledge. Lots of guidelines around the best uses of AI, ethical guidelines that are not only aligned to international standards, but also some of the guidelines that have been issued are aligned to Islamic principles as well, CxO, for example. So the approach is very much sort of light touch. This is how you should deploy AI, but without the necessary regulation in terms of, if you don't, these are the potential penalties and fines. And I think that's appropriate. I think we're really at the inflection point regionally and globally in terms of what AI can do. It can do for the individual, it can do for groups, society, organizations, countries and, of course, humanity. And the challenge there, and I think this question is being asked globally now, is how much do we regulate? How much do we regulate AI? And just following on from what Imran said earlier, yes, we know the GDPR was the gold standard, and that was deemed the Brussels effect because it went globally. And there was a huge expectation that would also happen with the EU AI Act. And of course, that was definitely the expectation up until the Paris AI Action Summit, where there was a seismic shift from the US in terms of we want to innovate without the regulation, right? And that certainly sent, I think, shockwaves through Europe, if not globally. Globally, only for those countries that were thinking about passing more stringent regulations. And now the approach, and I think it was less than a day, Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, it was less than a day when the EU dropped the EU AI Liability Directive as a direct result of that conference, where we were being told we need to innovate whilst also remaining some degree of compliance, and that's the gray area. And then only yesterday I was reading Mario Draghi. I'm not sure if he's a former commissioner of the EU, certainly well up there in the ranks. He's now commissioned a report in terms of the overlaps between privacy and the EU AI Act, and perhaps there were, and the report is suggesting that some elements are too onerous. And now there's discussions of the GDPR potentially, and I'm in no position to say otherwise, potentially being somewhat watered down to allow for this AI innovation. So whilst all of this is happening in Europe and the US, with the executive orders being invoked and then revoked, and with the Liability Act being discussed and then removed, the position taken by the Middle East is actually right where it should be. Understanding the possibilities of AI, pulling out the guidelines in terms of what should be done ethically, and as compliance and privacy experts, we're always ethically aligned. I also sit on the board of the Ethical AI Alliance. So these guidelines in terms of the ethical AI deployment, we don't need regulations to tell us how to deploy. We need strong practitioners in governance, risk, and compliance to be able to understand what the organizations are doing and to deploy it in the right manner.
Absolutely. I mean, the right coordination with the related stakeholders is very important. And of course, it's GDPR, when almost more than a year back, we have celebrated its 5th birthday. When there was a lot of changes and shift happened, we have observed all around the globe, not only the European Union area. So bring the discussion towards more local context now. So Daniel, what do you think is like how Qatari regulatory landscape is evolving around AI and digital privacy, particularly you have seen back in 2016 the data protection law was released, and now Qatar central bank have also released recently the data protection regulation. So now how do you see this landscape evolving within Qatari market?
Yeah, it's an interesting landscape, and it's certainly changing rapidly, I would say, globally, and I think that has a knock-on effect to us here. But there's really 3 parts to that question. I kind of just want to start with the privacy aspect of it. So we know that Qatar had its state law back in 2016, came into force a few years later, almost ahead of the GDPR. But that was the first real privacy law in the region. But Europe had privacy laws for decades, and people have gotten used to it and they understood it. So it's been a seismic shift here, this idea of privacy and privacy regulations in the GCC, and in Qatar in particular. But that law is now in force. The National Cybersecurity Agency have a data protection office. They've issued directives forcing firms to comply with certain aspects of it. I think they've done 2 now. We in the QFC have updated our law, again, very much like the GDPR, and we're enforcing our law. We're getting there. There's more we need to do. We know there's more updates to the law that we have to do, but I think privacy itself is evolving. I think we're getting more awareness dropped into society and to the firms. And I think to what Tahir said, having those practitioners within the firms will make a big difference to people understanding what the requirements are. From an AI side of things point of view, I think our lack of reaction, I think, was the right thing to do. And I think, as Tahir said, that taking a watching brief is really what we have done in the QFC in particular. We went, right, we're not going to just do a knee-jerk reaction and then just try and come up with a set of regulations. We don't really fully understand the technology. We don't fully understand the impacts and the implications of this technology to start writing regulations for it right now. I think that was ultimately the right approach. It's not that we're not drafting changes to the regulations or looking at what new regulations are needed, but we're just not going to launch something without being really carefully thought out and consulted on, certainly, before anything like that happens. But the one thing I would say, especially around AI, is that the current law still applies, and GDPR, the QFC data protection law, is technologically agnostic. It isn't, it was not written for a set of processing operations that we had in mind. It was written for what might happen into the future. And I think AI is a great example of that. It hasn't really changed how data is processed. It's just the volume and the complexity in which it can do that processing has changed. But things like data protection by default and by design still apply. And we're having to tell firms that you have to have ethical data processing. But that's what privacy by default and by design means. It means you have to have these ethical principles in place. And the enforcement powers that we have apply, and the accountability principles that sit within the regulations apply across the board. So, I do think that, we need to be better in enforcing the regulations we currently have before we start writing new regulations for AI and how it applies to AI. But I think one of the big things that I've noticed is, QFC, no firms really in the QFC are building their own AI platforms. They're using someone else's. So they're using OpenAI, Meta's, they're using ChatGPT. So, that relationship between data controller and data processor becomes really interesting. Or is it data controller to data controller? And I think firms have to get very clear and understand their relationship between the provider who has processed a lot of personal data to get the model to where it currently is, and how then they're going to use that model going forward. And I think that that hasn't really been really thought out as yet. And we're still playing through that as a regulator, how we can give better guidance and support. So we're working on a set of AI training materials that we're hoping to launch in the next couple of weeks to help. Again, I think, as Tahir said, it's to give pointers and principles and direction to how to do this in a compliant manner, and not a hard and fast set of rules. And I think that's going to make a big change. But coming to the central bank's data handling and protection regulations that they publish, that's a really interesting move. I think it's very easy to think of say GDPR as that's it, that's the only piece of data privacy regulations. But it's not. It's cross-sectorial. It's called the general data protection regulations for starters. So it is then supported by state laws, which are much more defined. And I think this data handling and protection regulations is a great example of a sectoral supervisor going, well, actually, the standards that are there for the country are not sufficient for our industry. So we're going to raise the bar. So we're going to force DPOs. We're going to put a general prohibition on international transfers without our approval and without an adequacy assessment of the jurisdiction it goes to. So I think, it's a really interesting move, and it'll be interesting to see if other sectoral regulators, like the health regulator, starts doing more, bespoke data protection regulations for their industry as well. And I think that's a great move, because I think, I'm always a bit weary of having a set of rules that apply generally across the board being very restrictive, because we still want to innovate, we still want business to flow. But the sectoral regulators have a much better view of their risks and for their members. And I think this is generally a really good approach. So I'm very supportive of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for very insightful, viewpoint on the local landscape. And definitely, from my standpoint, it's really important to have a one common, more concise way forward from a national perspective, because that may introduce a more the sectoral, I think, the race and the struggle to take a lead in this area, because each sectoral regulator will have their own flavor to bring in, and that may result into more regulatory inconsistencies, I may believe. So, Imran, would you have any points to add on this thing, or would you agree on my point of view as well?
I think the things what Daniel mentioned, that when a national data protection regulators or a regional like EU puts a regulation, they are putting a general regulation that applies to everyone, every company. But as Daniel mentioned, that certain industries may actually require a different level of protection. So, for example, he highlighted two of them: financial industries and healthcare industries, where the protection may require to be much heavier than other companies. For example, the retail shops and as such. So I do believe that the bar that is established by the national regulators or regional regulators needs to set a certain bars, and the bar is a minimum bar, and then others can adopt on top of that. But what you have to be mindful is that the new bar that is being established are not going to be putting too much restriction for the innovation and for the global nature of the trade and the economy that we are seeing right now. And that is where the mindfulness really needs to be. So, for example, if when Qatar Central Bank is putting the regulation about cross-border data transfer restrictions, certain restriction, are they going to really, how that is going to be applied, whether it is going to be applied to the processor and sub-processors and such, and whether it is going to be, especially in the digital fintech areas and as such, is that going to really create an impact, is what we really need to start to understand and make sure that it is done in a way, implemented in a way that is not going to be putting a restriction and a stagnant. At the same time, protecting the information, especially many of this information is not just on the personal data nature, but also the state security nature, because the digital technology can be also used against the state by even looking at the behavior of its citizens. So I think it's an approach that needs to be observed and made sure that it's happening in the right way.
Absolutely, because as far as the central bank is concerned, I mean, they can put more restrictions of sharing the financial data within their jurisdiction, though. But when it comes to the healthcare, of course, the HMC or the MOPH have to take care of the more defining the regulations. So Tahir, if you have any point to add on what has been discussed.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of international data flows. I think we've gone too far the other way. I'm going to take the alternate approach. I think now, as a result of data localization, data sovereignty, that is severely impacting startups, fintechs, health techs, and innovation, especially as they're utilizing AI. Data knows no borders, and AI is nothing without data and the algorithm and the actual individuals itself. I've got startups, scale-ups that I advise in the region. They all need to avail themselves to powerful GPUs, and they're not. Though that compute power is not available locally, so they have to utilize cloud providers. Not all the cloud providers have a regional presence. How can they continue to grow? And they're not sending. We go through the channels and the risks and the risk assessments of the data. We put in place the correct kind of technology. But where we have these blanket bans that all data should remain either on-prem or within sovereign cloud, I think is really hindering the progress of not just these organizations, but of the actual locality and the country itself, because we have to avail ourselves to much more powerful systems, much more powerful compute. We cannot do that if we start to simply come back and say all data must remain sovereign. It's a risk. Everything we do is a risk-based approach. Let's understand the risks as opposed to just saying no. And I mean, Daniel, you're a regulator, but I've spoken to many regulators in the region, and when I ask them the actual question, tell me why metadata can't leave your region, I met with a blank face. You know, the laws are there, but the understanding behind the laws is perhaps not always there.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that one, because it's a really interesting point, because this is more than just a risk-based analysis. This is not just a pure economic perspective. Countries take a national security, they take a citizen protection view across the board when they're setting these regulations. And yet we can sit here and go, yeah, it stifles innovation, it's problematic, it's all these things. But ultimately, governments have to balance much more complex interactions than just the economy. They have a lot of other things and a lot of other lobby groups and other political pressure being applied across the board. So like I feel it, and I do think there is that question of whether or not sovereignty and localization will ultimately stifle innovation. I think that's a valid question. And I think, I don't think anything is ever set in stone. So I think we see the central bank saying, yes, they prohibit data transfers for this type of data before approval. And that's today. They might find that this becomes a major barrier to growth and inefficiency within the financial sector market, and therefore they might just approve everything, or they might change the regulation, or they might find a compromise to make it work across the board. And I think, I'm always mindful there's a lot of political decisions made in relation to localization that aren't just necessarily pure, say, logical or for what because we lack the knowledge that they have when they're making these decisions.
Daniel, I've certainly seen that in another regulator in the region, where they took a very hard stance, and then over the next 2 to 3 years, that stance has gradually become more in terms of data sharing, and they're now going through another review with regards to being able to send even more data. But I agree with you. National security, citizens' rights are all very important at the heart of what the government does. But as you said, nothing's ever set in stone. And as certain lobby groups, as industry groups go to these the regulators and say we need more data transfers for these reasons, they take the right approach. Say, okay, let's go back to consultation and let's see what we can do to allow you to innovate whilst maintaining our very necessary national security.
Yeah, I mean, we saw with the Saudi law how when they got their initial set of feedback to the first draft law, they went, well, actually, no, we're going to go back to the drawing board and rewrite this based on the feedback we got. And they took another year. And that to me is a really mature approach to handling this very complex, where it's very easy for a regulator or for a government body to think we know what's best. But I think listening to the business, listening to consultants, listening to experts like yourself and Imran, and they went back and said, right, yeah, we're gonna take another look at this. That is just really encouraging.
Yeah. So from a data sovereignty point of view, Imran, I'll come back to you. I just wanted to add another flavor to the same very interesting discussion which is going on. From a data sovereignty point of view, that's of course the legislation is one part, lobbying and the the regulators, the way they think. How about lack of awareness as well? Because the most of the people who are actually into this thing, such as Tahir, which mentioned that they do not understand that there's a difference between data and metadata. So if there's no issue whatsoever leaving the metadata from your jurisdiction as well. So let's take a view from Imran as well. That what's your view on that? There's a serious lack or of awareness as well which among the region, which is affecting the overall maturity of this adopting these standardization as well?
Let me address two parts in here. One is basically the metadata, and then the second topic is basically what we are discussing earlier in terms of the regulatory areas and the challenges. On the metadata side of it, there are metadata that can actually re-identify individuals. So what you mentioned is that is the understanding really is clear among the professionals and then the regulators, right? Because there is two parts on it. Well, for example, AI technology are still new and we really don't know where fully it's going to go in. That's the areas of challenges of understanding even in among the regulators. But in the areas of the metadata, it's a lot more clear, but is it clear to understand what data can be put together, and especially different sets of data, if they can be put together, can they really re-identify? And that identification risk, is it fully understood or not? And I think that's the challenge for the professionals most of the time, because I think the privacy professionals are still struggling with that particular things, because many of the privacy professionals are what you say, coming from the legal background, not a technical background, such that they really don't always understand this nuance of differences. So I would basically look it from that perspective. In the areas of the earlier discussion, while data is the oil that we always say, the GPUs and CPUs are the engine, and the restriction on certain international trade in that area that Tahir was kind of eluding by saying that we don't have GPUs in every country. And that restriction, that particular things came out of two things. One is a demand and supply issue, but there is also export restriction issues coming out from the countries which are really producing these GPUs and CPUs. And that is one of the things that's preventing a globalization of this particular technology. And so we just cannot look at a problem from one angle to say, hey, we are going to do this because of that, because that is, as Daniel mentioned, there is national security concerns about the data, and countries definitely are trying to put regulations and such, because they really don't fully understand the risk that may come in the future. So they're trying to be, some countries are trying to be overcautious about how the data are going to leave the country, because they expect that other countries may use that data, which may put them in a national security situation. So it's a very complex problem and requires multi-dimensional response to these things. We cannot just say, hey, we are going to lower the guard in these areas because of a challenge in other areas. It's something that has to be really looked at, and countries at the national level need to facilitate for the companies in their particular jurisdiction to take the benefit and provide the solution as much as possible. So like countries really need to work to either innovate in those areas, or find a way to work with the respective producing I would say the companies and the countries, to make sure those restrictions are alleviated for them.
So Tahir, would you like to connect on Imran's points?
Yeah, look, getting access to GPUs, obviously there's a worldwide shortage, and everyone's in a rush to acquire those. Yes, there's export controls. Now, we know that certainly within the region, Saudi's investing anywhere from $200 to $500 billion to build, data centers. But of course, there's a huge timeline involved in that. There's anywhere from, I'm not expert in the construction of data centers, but it could take anywhere from, for 3 to 7 years, right? They're also getting involved in setting up their own fabrication facilities to produce their own, GPUs, CPUs, semiconductors, and that could take up to 10 years. So yes, I understand that not all of the challenges of being able to remain sovereign as a result of decisions made by the regulator. And also there's a general trend now for the hyperscalers. Hyperscalers are, of course, spinning up their operations within each of the geos because they're seeing the demand. And that will then, I always take a measured approach. I mean, if you have a hyperscaler within your geo, is it truly sovereign? Do they have, under the US FISA regulations, a US entity has to give access to the data to certain agencies within the US. So, it always has to be a measured approach. But yes, I take your point. I agree with you, Imran, that we have to look at it from the legal perspective. We have to take a measured approach to enable organizations to flourish and to utilize AI. And then from the supply side, there's very little we can do because these are negotiations that happen at the governmental level, right? And if there's export restrictions, but again, let's talk pragmatically. Let's talk about what happened in the first week of February when DeepSeek was rolled out. All of the export regulations were there. All of the challenges. Okay, all of the challenges that we were talking about were evident, and yet everyone was talking about the huge capabilities of DeepSeek, utilizing not the market leading GPUs, utilizing local intelligence, local power, of course, international data. Let's not go into that, how it was trained, but at a fraction of the price. So it can be undertaken if the right minds get together locally, right? And again, it's about getting the right, the right combination of stakeholders. You don't need the best technology in order to be able to innovate, and that's been proven now. And even President Trump, he said himself, he goes, this is great. We don't have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars. This is the kind of disruption that we need.
Yep. So, Daniel, I think your views.
Yeah, I think it is geopolitical. It's economic. There are global sanctions in place for certain countries, so you can't do trading with those firms. Like it is a massively complex kind of world that we're evolving into, and this technology is still very, very young. It is learning what it can do. It is still just algorithmic. It is still just a set of rules. They're complex, but they're just a set of rules, and it is just delivering an outcome based on those rules. But this technology is evolving, and as we talk about your general intelligence, we talk about super intelligence, we talk about agentic AI. Like it is going to rapidly change and will evolve over time. And whether or not it will still need billions of dollars to create, or whether you can take the ones that have already been created and they create something new from them as they start learning from each other, and can that be done in a cheaper way, in a more efficient way? I think it's hard to, and I think this is actually why, if we go back to, we don't want to regulate this yet. It goes back to this point where it is moving way too fast for us to really understand what we should be regulating. And we end up regulating the wrong thing. And I think the EU AI Act, which has had a lot of criticism, is actually going to companies going, well, let's just do business in the US and the rest of the world, and let's not necessarily go to Europe then, because the rules around high risk models or even medium risk models are so onerous that, like, what's the point? And I think that's the thing we need to be careful of. And I think governments and need to be careful when they're regulating this stuff. But yeah, it's evolving. But just I wanted to mention that point about metadata, and metadata can definitely be used to identify people. And I think what we're lacking is, and then this technology, this AI, and its ability to add bits of data together to create and identify the individual at the back end is incredible. If we think about, there was a paper done in, I think, 2007, where they looked at spatiotemporal data. So looking at a ping from a cell tower, so a time and a location, and all they needed in a population of like 3 million people was 4 spatiotemporal points, and they could identify at a 95% confidence level an individual in that population. And that was in 2007. So, I'm always a little bit, going, it's just metadata. it's okay. I'm like, I'm a little bit more concerned that it might not just be metadata. And there are better minds than mine going, well, how can we combine this to identify the individual? And that terrifies me.
Yeah, I think it's ongoing effort, and it's a long journey to address the technological, the complexities while adopting these technologies. So let me bring another flavor into our discussion now. It's too much like getting into the same, data sovereignty we have discussed a lot. So let me ask the question to Tahir, because since you are from a vast experience from consulting background, and from your experience, there are a lot of multinationals today spread in different geographies, and they have been bombarded with the different or recently newly evolved regulations. So, what are the challenges these multinationals are facing to comply with these, ever-changing privacy regulations?
I think we've touched a little bit about this already, Ahmad, is that firstly, even the regulations themselves are dynamic. So, the GDPR from 2016 is not the GDPR we have today. The initial draft of the PDPL in Saudi Arabia is not the draft that we have today. And as Daniel correctly said, I was actually alluding to that regulator, Daniel, but you picked it up, right? They're constantly evolving. So we're not in a static environment. So for multinational organizations, you need to have the right stakeholders, horizon scanning. And I'm not legally trained, although I've been in the world of privacy for a very long time, right? I always look to the experts in this domain. So having the right stakeholder group, right, in terms of where these are the geographies in which we operate, right? Who internally has that skill set in order to be able to identify the regulations, how those regulations are changing. So we look at an applicability assessment. We look to our friends and colleagues in legal. Though, as like, always go to a legally qualified professional here. Don't second guess. Imran, I'm not sure if you're a qualified lawyer. I'm not. I would never second guess the regulations. I understand them, but the fine details and the nuances, I will go to internal general counsel. I will take it externally and say, right, exactly what does this mean for my organization? So that's challenge number one. It's a rolling dynamic landscape. It's dynamic not only in terms of the privacy regulations, but as was highlighted earlier, we operate sectorally, and then there's multitudes of sectoral regulations. So you can have an organization that spans manufacturing, it can be into healthcare, it can be into financials, it can be developing all manner of products. You have product safety laws, right? Hundreds of product safety laws, right? You have financial sector laws that differ widely across the world. Healthcare laws, of course, in each and every geography. And then we have the international standards such as HIPAA. All of these have to be viewed, assessed, and what are the risks posed to the organization itself. So these challenges are huge, but with the right stakeholders, and of course the right technology as well, because it's not just a manual effort. The right technology as well can assist you there in identifying the laws. And of course, once you've identified, don't just identify and say, right, we'll go back and review. Put some risk against those actual laws. This is the law that, but for our organization and in this sector and this product, this is high risk, right? And why do you do that? Because we have scarce resources. Very few, very few compliance teams number in the hundreds, and certainly within the Middle East, the GCCs, the numbers are very small compared to what the team sizes are internationally. So identify the high risk areas, put a rating against them, and then you can spend your time and effort, which is scarce, against those high risk areas. But also always have a team member constantly scanning, utilize the right kinds of technologies, and then get that messaging to the leadership. Why are we doing all this scanning and this risk identification for? Get that messaging. Don't operate in a silo. Get it to leadership and say, these are the risks that we've identified. These are the high risk areas. These are the mitigations that we suggest. And of course, with that will probably come some budgetary requirement, right? So we have to operate holistically within the organization rather than operating in silos and only thinking about one particular risk and one particular geography. And then in terms of implementation, if possible, if you have the team size and the right technology and the budgets that allow, implement best practices whilst being mindful of local nuances. I mean, you can't possibly implement, Imran, you're a global data protection officer. You can't implement 70 different versions of data privacy regulations for everywhere that Al Jazeera operates. You want to implement the gold standard and be mindful, actually, hold on, in California, there's a do not sell. There's slight nuances within South Africa. There's a difference of consent within Kenya. You'll know what the nuances are, but you're not going to have 70 different teams implementing 70 different variations. You want to have one best practice and being mindful again of those, and that mindfulness comes from horizon scanning, having your stakeholders on the ground, be it compliance experts, be it your what we call your champions. They can be from the business unit, but they'll feedback and they'll say, Imran, actually now within this geo, there's this is what we're trying to do within our business unit, and we heard that this there'll be an impact on data. What are your thoughts? So it's to go back to the consultancy cliche, it's people, processes, and technology.
Exactly, and just let me add on the same challenge which you and me we've been facing while advising or recommending the strategies on the organizations, is that, especially in particularly taking the Middle Eastern example, that a lot of organizations have been coming from a more security or resilience, like the efforts been driven, and now the privacy has been introduced, where the legal counsel do not have any idea what is the data privacy regulations and all that. So what would be the right forum in the organizations to take up these discussions, to engage all the leadership stakeholders? Because why I'm asking this question is to give a benefit of doubt, is that we do have risk committees in the especially particularly in financial sector, in banks. We have the information security committees as well, defined somewhere, IT steering committees, but there's nothing which we have observed, at least very recently, the privacy committee, where only the legal counsel and the DPOs get involved, sit with the C-suite and explain the privacy challenges. How do you
it's a huge challenge that I've faced over the last three to 5 years in the region, because privacy is so new. Of course, it's not new in Qatar with the first regulations, but it was never effectively implemented. Privacy, we know it's there, we don't really understand it, and no one's enforcing it. So let's just let it just sit wherever. And typically within the region, it sits within the CxO function, and it's a huge challenge, because there's a direct conflict of interest, because one is very much controls based and one is risks and principles based. So I've had many conversations with CxOs, quite delightful, somewhat humorous conversations, where I've gone in and said, right, Tahir, just tell us about the controls we need, the controls and the technology. I'm like, well, how are the controls and technology going to assist you when we're talking about data that hasn't even been collected yet? We're talking about privacy notices. Like, what's that? So the CxOs only protect the data within the ecosystem. Privacy is much wider. It's before, during, after, all the way in the actual information lifecycle. I mean, whenever I advise, I always talk about the correct target operating model. And of course, we can't expect perfection overnight. It's going to be a slow movement, and that movement is now happening. CxOs are now in the region. Different geographies have different levels of maturity. So Saudi, because of the highly enforceable law, they have distinct DPO functions now, right? Distinct DPO functions. Very few of those functions sit now within the security function. Typically, they sit under data governance within that geography. In the UAE, it's still very much within CxO and also within Qatar. The right kind of forums, and it comes down to awareness and speaking to C-suite, and this is what I do a lot of, because the actual challenges of the individuals that want to implement privacy, their hands are tied, because C-suite, so we've got a CxO taking care of that. So I'll then go in and say, right, yes, the CxO has charge of the function, but they don't have the knowledge, the skill sets, the right individuals, right? At the moment, there's a lot of what's called double hatting going on, especially within Qatar. The CxO has been given the challenge and the function. They'll pull someone from the security team and say, right, you are now, congratulations, you are now the DPO. What does that mean? Don't worry about that, just get on with it, right? So the awareness and training. So I like to get in front of C-suite and say, like, how can we put together the right set of stakeholders? Now, I know a lot of the banks, they have the CROs, and I love the CRO function. I love the general counsel function because they understand risks, they understand laws, and they understand principles. So wherever possible, utilize those stakeholders. They're always going to be your friends. If you veer down the route of information security or cybersecurity, it's always going to be a control-based function. So get that awareness. Set up those workshops. Daniel, I know you do a great job in terms of a lot of in-person events and a lot of sort of also webinars and training and awareness sessions. What you mentioned earlier, you're putting out some guidance. That's the kind of guidance that the region needs. But also having the right set of external stakeholders. And I know it's not perfect. I know that external stakeholders that have the same capability as internal ones would get a better reception. This is what consultants are viewed as experts. Imran, no doubt, is probably more expert than me. But if Imran went to C-suite and said, I need this, I'd say, Imran, please go back to the office. Let's speak about it next year. If I came in and echoed what Imran said, oh, Tahir is an expert. Yes, let's take this seriously. So, we need to work collectively to get that messaging to the leaders and say, right, how can we set about the right kind of work groups and the stakeholder groups, your steering committees, or to try to elevate the data privacy function to where it is within Europe. It's not going to happen overnight. It's certainly a 2 to 5 year journey, I see.
Yeah, we rightfully said the external stakeholders are actually the game changers. I'm coming back. I'm coming to both of you because Daniel and Imran are on the other side of the picture. So let's hear them out first. Let's start from Imran. Yeah,
So
just to add on that thing, because I'm so touched on this aspect, like when we go and we receive a royal treatment being an external advisors, and we are being paid off as well, though the local teams in the organizations are equally qualified and efficient, but they're not being heard. So it's quite a difference, to add the value and to expedite the effort there. So over to you, Imran.
So I think it's Tahir actually highlighted some of the critical challenges that organization faces, especially multinational organization. Because when we look at a law, I mean, I'm just finishing my legal education degrees that will be finished next month officially. So then after that, Tahir, you can call me the the legal professional in that way. So I would basically say that if you look at the from the regulatory perspective, from the legal perspective, we have the law like GDPR that came in, or Qatar PDPPL. Then we have the regulatory guidance or regulatory instruction coming in. So you look at the EDPB in the Europe, or ICO in the UK, over here NCSA and QFC. You will find that they are providing guidance on top of that provides that, okay, this is how we interpret the implementation of this law needs to be. Then you have the case study. So I know in Qatar we don't have enough of that, but if you look at the Europe, we see a lot of case studies. So case studies then says, okay, how the legal judges and as such interprets that and balances that. So this is how it normally needs to be looked at it. Now that is in one jurisdiction, and I think Tahir brought about the challenges when you have, you know, tens or hundreds of jurisdictions. How do you really do that effectively? And I think Tahir pointed out is that really look at your own organizational risk in different jurisdictions to say, hey, in this particular jurisdiction, do I really have enough business interest to really implement a robust regulatory regime in there or not? Or should I take on a more of a golden standards like GDPR and the regulation coming around it, and then supplement that with that? So generally, I prefer to have a what you call a integrated framework. So rather than choosing all these things, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to keep 10 different or 20 different regulations to your operational team to say, hey, you have this 20 different set of requirement that you need to implement. So I rather actually create a unified approach and unified requirements that goes to your operational team. So your operational team is not juggling with too many other regulations or too many things. That is the role of privacy professional working with your legal and the GRC to really establish a unified requirement that needs to really go to the business. So there should not be, and this is one of the things that I believe many of the organizations faces the challenge, is that they don't have this unified approach between the CxO, between their GRC, between the privacy professionals. Each of them are coming with their own requirements to the operations. Rather, they should work together to establish a unified requirement that takes on privacy, security, and other requirements like product liability and as such, and make sure that an approach is unified, built into each of these things, all these requirements, so that they implement one thing. And as you do the regulatory monitoring, working with your legal team to say, hey, there is a case that happened, means I need to change something in my requirement. Maybe my requirement already have it from another jurisdiction, but that's come in or a new regulation comes in, you need to take that saying, does my existing implementation requirement already fulfills those new things that I'm actually seeing? And if they are not, then you make the business decision. Is that what is the cost of implementing that versus cost of a fine, right? So you need to always do that risk assessment, and that is the job of this unified DPO, CxO, GRC function to really come in together to try to implement that in that approach. That's from the regulatory perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the areas of organizational things, I think it's a big challenge. Like, where does it sit? Where does decision making really takes place? There definitely needs to be a C-suite level of support. But your challenge is, if you don't have a unified approach, then you have separate CxO, separate risk management, separate DPO, and separate IT. All of these things are juggling and struggling with the same resource, same skill set. And this is a challenge for the HR to saying, hey, how is my functions and roles should be really divided between the competency that is required versus the function that is required, and the independence. In that regard, I want to actually highlight one thing Tahir mentioned when you have it with CxO, the privacy function. Recently, Europe, under the GDPR, Article 42, the code of Article 42 basically provides what is it called, code of conduct or certificate of compliance, right? So Euro privacy is something that they have adopted under the Article 42, which basically provided, say for example, the one that is going to identify the legal basis. Okay, so the person that is going to identify the legal basis, they provide a recommendation about the skill set or the competency the person requires. And you can see in there that they require certain legal education or experience in that area. A CxO generally is not necessarily going to have that. So when you are basically doing certain functions, yes, technically you might be able to implement certain controls, but the lawful basis of collecting that data and holding that data and data subject rights that you need to fulfill, that is not an issue of control, right? That's the issue of providing certain notices and as such. That is not a technical control that generally a CISO and as such will try to implement. So this is something that the regulators and the Qatar Central Bank recently in their regulation have called for a DPO, right? And the reason is that they understood that this function cannot be done separately, and it has to be done someone with that experience and with that level of independence. So I just want to highlight that as well, because I think that is a challenge that we are going to be interested in seeing.
Very, very well said, Imran. Because from a unified approach point of view, when I came, I have a very relevant case study last year, which happened like in every stakeholder, which was called to discuss the DPO meeting discussion, was having a different view of their own risks or risk portfolios. So that enhances the need of one unified, well integrated risk register of your organization so that everyone can see the risk based approach to the one risk portfolio. So Daniel, your take on this, please.
Yeah, that was a really informative and really deep set of answers, both from Tahir and Imran. I fully agree. I mean, I think an ERM program, an integrated enterprise risk management framework that looks at all your risk programs, all your risk taking departments across the board, and have one approach, all brought under one body, is the right way to go. But one of the things I wanted to point out, it's something I have seen since 2016, since the first GDPR was published, and we had 2 years to implement. One of the big issues that firms have will be how, and the data handling and protection regulations of the central bank, the financial services firms will find this too. How do they find a qualified DPO, right? Because I have seen it for the last 9 years with people who have gone off and done a course online and got a CIPE, and they're suddenly a privacy expert. They go in for a HR interview. They are very charismatic. They are very charming. They're very verbose, and they convince the firm to hire them, even though they have no real practical experience. Yet they also don't really know the subject matter, because companies lack the ability to actually assess whether or not a DPO is at the right level. It can look like that on paper, but how would they even know what question to ask, and even then to how to interpret that answer to know this person was an expert? I think it brings me back to something Tahir said, which is the role of external stakeholders, the role that he plays when he goes and he talks to a firm as the expert. Not only does he get treated as more of an expert because he's external, but he has the skills. And I think firms need to really consider, if they've never hired a DPO before, to really go out and ask a professional, someone who's worked in the industry for a long time, to help them select somebody. Because I've seen so much snake oil being sold to firms since 2016, and programs I had to come in and basically redesign from the ground up because what they were given was just non-practical. It was just and wrong in a lot of cases. So I think that's going to be one of the big issues that firms are going to have. And it's like a CISO, they can know a security professional, and they know what questions to ask if this person is making stuff up. But how would they know how to recruit a DPO? So I think this is a very specific set of skill sets. I think external stakeholders and engagement is going to be critical for firms who have not done this before, who are new on that journey, which, let's be fair, is most firms across the GCC. So I think that's going to be the big challenge.
Thank you very much. So now we have since already hit the mark of 1 hour, and I still have a lot of questions to ask, having very interesting discussion going on. So let's change the perspective, because since we already touched upon the landscape, we touched upon the regulatory roles and some privacy governance questions as well. So my next question is towards the effect of these non-conformities towards our society. So let me ask my first question in this context to Imran, that since your organization is a global has a global audience, so how do you see the AI generated content affecting the trust in the media, and what ethical safeguards are needed around?
Um, I know previously we talked about not having too much regulations, but I think this is a challenging area. So I mean, we are seeing that AI, basically using the AI, you can actually create a content that looks as good as human-made content. And especially so in the areas of the media where a we know that a simple news that created a blockade in Qatar. So we are actually talking from our own personal experience of facing a challenge of a misinformation creating a national level security issues and a national disaster. So coming from that, I think the Qatar would need to really look into how do we really handle the fake news and the impact of that fake news. It can start a war. It can definitely start a blockade in this particular region. So AI generated AI generated content from the perspective of the business. It of course AI can enhance the production and the speed of content production and going to the audience. So definitely it has benefit, and organization like a media organization like Al Jazeera may use such technologies to ensure a certain level of even content verification. So when the content is coming in, it can be used to verify content, and it can also use to in the content production life cycle and even the distribution life cycle. It can use that. Let's take an example that you can do context-based translation, for example, right? AI can actually help you in doing that work. But at the same time, because the content can be, it's hard to tell the difference between a content that is AI generated versus a human generated. A trust in the media is, I think, as of right now, all-time low. I mean, we really, like I can tell you right now, my mom will call me up saying, I saw this in Facebook. I'm like, okay, don't trust Facebook, right? The news in Facebook. So we see that the spread of the information goes out and with the fake information, and that has eroded any confidence, much of any confidence in the media. So given that this is a challenge, I do believe that the question is, does the existing legal framework that we have, whether it's from the GDPR privacy regulations or media regulations, are they really sufficient enough to provide that protection? Or do we really need additional protection? It may be you use the same existing framework. Say, for example, you have Qatar has a media law. The UK has an Ofcom regulations, and the US has the FCC regulations. Should that be existing regulation be enhanced more through regulatory guidance to provide certain level of requirement coming into the media, to like what we saw in the EU AI Act, is that okay, if you are creating a AI generated content, then it has to be clearly marked, like for example. So would you put certain of that kind of a regulation so that people who are inherently will not be able to tell the difference can tell the difference that this is actually not a man-made, it's a machine-made content. But again, at what level of machine made should be marked? Like, if it is in real information and you are just using a AI generated way of reading it, should that be marked? Or is it the information is completely made up and you used whether humans or AI to generate that? It's not really an easy area to to deal with it, because but a clear regulation is really required in that particular area. So I do see a fake news, AI generated fake news have increased that challenge, and it requires regulation, from whether coming from the media regulations or from the other regulations, but it has to be really strongly addressed, because the risk is very high on these particular areas. We trust the media, we trust the media organizations, but media organizations are also struggling to really identify that clearly, given the content coming in from anyone now can create a content and get 8 billion people to watch them.
Exactly, as the attacks have become more and more devious these days, especially considering the deep fakes and that kind of a technology. When yes, like, the organizations were having the trivial approaches or the procedural controls to verify the authenticity of the source of the information, though. But with these deep fakes kind of thing, like detecting, the deep fake detection, I think this is a new area from a technology perspective, which let's hear out from Tahir on this thing, like, how critical it is for the organizations to adopt these deep fake detection technologies to ensure the misinformation or disinformation, I would say.
Well, Ahmed, you've opened a can of worms there. Because you remember when ChatGPT was first introduced, and we had all of these AI detection writing tools that gave you a percentage of this text was generated by AI. Now, almost all of them have disappeared because AI has become so good you can no longer detect it. Right? So that's from a written perspective. From a deep fake perspective, of course, I work in technology circles, and there's always technology that's being developed and rolled out every month or so. For deep fakes, yes, definitely. Only last week I was introduced to a new technology, right? So if we remove the scripting element and just assume that AI is too far advanced to really notice AI, what AI detected written text. Sometimes I can see when text is being written by AI just because of the sort of similarities in the paragraph structure or the way that certain symbols are used. But in terms of deepfake, yes, hugely concerning, ethically, politically, morally, in terms of what can be done. It can be used to create international conflicts. It can be used for fraud. Very prevalent in the world of fraud now is deepfakes. I know of at least 5 organizations that had multi-million dollars extracted from them as a result of a conversation just like this. We're on a web call. You see Tahir, the deep fake. Tahir happens to be the chief financial officer. Daniel, we're going through a top secret merger and acquisition. I need you to wire, $500,000 in every 2 days. Thank you, Daniel's saying, I'll pay that myself, Tahir, when you need it, right? $500,000 to this account every 2 days. This is, and you're speaking to here, you recognize to here, it's my voice, it's my image. So that's very concerning. And technology is assisting us there. But of course, as technology develops, also the methods that are utilized by these third parties also becomes increasingly sophisticated. And unfortunately, often we're playing catch up, right? One of the first, one of the first group of individuals to utilize ChatGPT was actually the hacking community, the bad actors. They utilized it for all manner of things, right? To extract information, to write malicious code, to find new threat vectors, to do constant monitoring. So the technology companies are always playing catch up, but we must look to leading technology. And of course, it has to be use case driven, because what can be used to detect deep fakes within the media industry may not be able to detect a AI generated content in a different context.
Right. So let's take Daniel's opinion on this thing as well.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I think it's the short answer. And I think it's we're on a path towards it. And then you start looking at agentic AI, so agents. So why wouldn't I have an agent that looks like me, sounds like me, can interact? I could be the agent. I could be deepfake right now. I could be sitting in another room, typing out what it says, and it knows my mannerisms, it knows my bouncing, it knows my hand gestures. So and it looks like me, it sounds like me, and it actually is a reflection of me. So there's positives and negatives to this technology as it moves forward. And I think when it comes to, say, business, and it comes to sending the 500,000 businesses, and it goes back to that ERM question, risk management programs will have to change and adapt to the new risk profile and to the new vector. I worked in operational risk for decades. Our job was to save people from themselves. That's really what it is. I mean, most operational risk events don't happen because of sophisticated hackers or movie level heists. It is somebody just doing something by accident or stupidity, or just they want to help the CEO, so they make that transfer today. And I think that's what's, we have to just evolve our detection and our real world control environments to help detect and stop these deepfakes from becoming the issue that they're going to be, because they're going to happen. And the bad actors, as Tahir said, will always be ahead of the game. We're always playing catch up. Our job is to put controls at the back end to help prevent it from an organizational point of view from impacting the firm. But there's definitely benefits as well from the agentic side. So I think it's a trajectory we're on. It's happening today. So we have to, I suppose, live with it and learn about it, and try and find ways to make it useful for us and not just be the detriment. But back to, I just wanted to say what Imran had mentioned about the fake news. Fake news has always been there. Like since the first written news, it was fake news. Made up stories by AI, made up stories by humans. It's been happening, dropping propaganda over war-torn countries. Again, well understood methods of operating. So again, it's just the scale that's changed, and the number of channels that this is available on. So that's really what's happened. And I think we have to get better at educating people to be critical thinking, to go, is this really true based on everything else that I know? And I think the big danger we have is social media companies just pushing the same content, reinforcing. I think that's where, as Imran said, we need probably a bit more regulation and a requirement for transparency.
Yeah, I mean,
if I add one more. So Daniel mentioned, but I think one thing also happened is that it became ease and cost effective, right? So where a fake news creation in, say, 20 years ago would have cost a X number of amount, now even a child can go and create a fake news, right? So that ease and spread both have gone significantly up, right? And that has created a threat, and that is where I see a challenge that regulators really need to look at, and it may not be again, technology providers needs to be. This is where the technology providers, like anyone who is helping in supporting and developing the content, should they have any obligation in marking it or in making that possibility, or at least being put in a way that can be detected that this is actually the AI agent of Daniel and not Daniel himself, right? That things can be done from the provider possibly. Then basically also a challenge, I think, is where the platform providers, whether we should hold them responsible to a certain level if they have the ability to detect or not. So in the areas of, say, for example, cable TV, we know the cable TV operators were responsible for content that comes on the cable TV, but not on the internet platforms like either YouTube or X or as such or Facebook. Their liability, whether they should have any liability or not. This is because this is not a problem that can be addressed from one aspect. So you don't want to put a over regulation, but you have to put the amount that there is a easy for them to be able to capable of doing that. So if you don't do that, like for example, Facebook is making money, right, through this information. So if they are able to make money from the information, should we hold them certain level of responsibilities to make sure that they are they can implement controls, they can implement requirements that is not an overburden, but there is a capability for them to do so. And this is where I think the regulators really need to be smart and do in a way proportionally, in a way that is not an over regulation, but a right amount of regulation, because we have a risk that cannot be addressed from one side only.
Yeah, very well said. And knowing that the AI is a double-edged sword, so we have to, of course, struggle while adopting in the positive side of it, and of course to take care of the dark side of the AI, the negative use of it. So from considering that point, and just let's since we are almost about to hit mark of 1 hour 25 minutes, so I just wanted to start towards the wrapping up our discussion. So, and linking up our discussion towards that, what Imran mentioned some time back is about having the unified approach is pivotal to move forward. So, it's an open question. Anyone can take a lead on answering this thing. So, do you think we are moving towards a harmonized global AI governance framework adoption, or will the fragmentation will persist, considering that the we have algorithmic bias, we have cultural biases to consider and all that. So from that context, who would like to take a lead to answer first?
I'll go first. I think in terms of principles, globally we're aligned on principles. We've got OECD principles, which very much at the forefront. We've got the principles from various UN agencies, the G7, the G20, individual country principles, and they're all aligned around ethics, responsibility, security, innovation, trustworthiness, the betterment of humanity. Others, such as Hudaria, law, fairness, human rights, democracy. So from a global alignment on principles, we're aligned. But unfortunately, talk is cheap, right? So we have these principles, and how do we now embed these principles, or what are the drivers for these principles for organizations to actually embed what's relevant to them? I think with the events of the past few months, it's clear now that there will not be a harmonized regulation. There's regulations in place that will be reviewed both within Europe and elsewhere. Other geographies are now very much saying, let's hold off, let's watch. Like Daniel said, we're patiently, we're watching the technology is moving so quickly. If we regulate today, it's going to be out of date a year from now. What's going to be current a year from now is going to be, at the moment, we're talking about AI. We're moving very quickly into AGI. I mean, I'm talking about the leaders. Altman, when he was first asked about when we'd get AGI, I think he said 2035. In his last interview, he said we're a few years away, right? So if we regulate too fast, we're constantly going to have to go back and review. So I think taking a more measured approach, trying to understand what these principles mean, and as practitioners in the field, taking these principles back to our organizations, embedding them into the programs as best we can without the drivers is the best approach we can take without any global regulations to really there to drive us into that implementation.
Daniel, Imran, would you agree with Tahir, especially in terms of I may have a different opinion on, but while he's saying globally we have agreed on the principles, though it's everyone have a different opinion though. So Daniel, let's start from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, I think there maybe it's not global, but there's a lot of the big players have gone, look, yeah, we need to do something in this space, and these principles are kind of the right way forward. I kind of think that that's the best we're going to get. I don't think we're going to see full harmonization across the board, not only because it's evolving technology, but also because there's geopolitical tensions in place that will always mean that someone will want to do something different than their neighbors are doing for whatever reason. So I think we'll never get a fully global set of frameworks for this. But what I do think what we need to do is ultimately empower the individuals. I think what we need is more consumer advocacy groups who fight the cause of the average person against these big tech firms who process their personal data. We know Max Schrems and Know Your Own Business are doing fantastic work over in Europe, but he is one small organization doing very bespoke work. What we need is more and more of these coming up to say, actually, you're using our data. We're going to represent 5 million people, and we're going to force you to do the right thing. I think that's what's ultimately needed.
Exactly. But what I was referring to is like, that generally when we talk about like algorithm or AI based bias and all that, so it's linked with some ethical value system, right? So where two nations, two countries with two different cultures, they cannot align with one value system, or they do not agree, and globally we are not agreed, or we are not on a single platform to agree or follow one value system. So if two humans cannot align together, so we cannot address the bias at the human level, so how are we going to address at the AI level? So anyway, let's take the discussion forward, and let's take what Imran has to say on this.
So actually, I asked both ChatGPT and DeepSeek a question on basically what do they call so basically, I asked the questions about whether Robin Hood syndrome is all right or not. I mean, taking the things from the rich and giving to the poor. So ChatGPT took the approach that the end just does not justify the means. So the means is as important as reaching to the end. Whereas DeepSeek took the approach that end justifies the means that if you are doing something good at the end, the means is all right. So that is an ethical, philosophical questions that a different society may look at it completely different ways. And as you mentioned that, any machine, human-made systems will, of course, be biased toward the human who made it, right? So that is part of the creator's bias that is going to be in the systems and as such. So given, I think what we are seeing is that there is a principle that OECD and others, international bodies have come together with. The challenge of this principle-based approach is the enforceability, because there is no penalization for enforcement. It's about goodwill. It's about people voluntarily doing things. So this principle works well when organizations or countries work with ethical standards. The problem happens is when they don't follow that, and that's where we need certain things that is beyond just this. Hey, follow this principle. And on the international front, I don't foresee countries coming together to say, hey, we are going to put some enforceable mechanisms to of a treaty or an agreement. I don't foresee that to happen until a disaster like Hiroshima happens, when the nuclear weapon was said, okay, we don't want to use the nuclear weapon anymore, right? I hope that we don't have to go through a disaster of something that is caused by this system going rogue and creating a mayhem around the world, where we need to wake up from. I do believe that countries have matured. The countries are, maturing countries can really take an approach that is more ethical. And this is not just the area of a corporation using the data. If we use AI in the military, defense sectors, it can become very much of a danger. And we saw some of the element that has been coming out from struggle that is happening in Palestine areas that we hear and we see. So there are challenges that we really need to start to look at it, not just corporations what we are doing and as such, but a broader use of the AI technologies in many areas. Given that, I would basically, given the time, I would also want to say one thing is that organizations should, what Daniel earlier highlighted, data protection by design and default, taking that into account, saying, hey, we have these principles coming from OECD, we have this regulation coming from GDPR or PDPPL or Qatar Central Bank regulations. Let's try to really implement that into our organization, in our practice, in our technology. And if we really start to look from the building that into the system, data protection by design and default, and understand the impact, I think if every developers, every organization who are implementing these solutions starts to really look at that from that aspect, I think we will have a better future. But unfortunately, that is not necessarily the case that happens, because when profit, takes a priority, then we see the challenges that we have.
Yeah, commercial benefits is always, as that's a very much relevant consequence of the capitalist mindset. It's another challenge of the designers of this such new AI system based new world order. So coming back to that point of since we have already 1 hour 36 minutes, and I need to head towards collecting the final takeaways. But before we do that, and I really like enjoying the discussion. So that's like I feel like we can keep gonna go on discussing the different aspects, especially relevant to this the bias thing, because if the God revealed his divine books to us, and the humanity has been distributed or divided into groups and subgroups, and I don't know how we're gonna come back to agree on one unified approach. That seems impossible until unless, as Imran mentioned, that we need another such global kind of a calamity may bring the humanity on the same page. But that's exactly my last question is heading towards. It is, which really requires your all collective wisdom here to recommend what and where the top leaders should think of. So, what's one policy, technology, or cultural shift needed to ensure AI benefits society without compromising privacy today?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I'm going to be, because I'm a technologist, so I love technology. I think privacy preserving technologies and how they operate are going to be massively important into the future, whether it's something like federated learning, for models, so the data is decentralized. Not one person has a view of all the data, but the models can learn from it in a way that preserves the privacy, and things like differential privacy as well, adding noise to data sets, making it much more difficult to identify the individuals. I think these type of technologies are going to become more and more prevalent, and there's a lot of firms coming up, a lot of very smart mathematicians coming online to help figure out ways of preserving privacy while still allowing economies to grow. And I think that's going to be a big change to the future, especially as we still see other technologies like quantum computing coming online into the future. We have to start really thinking in much more complex ways than we have done previously, I think.
Thank you. Imran?
So I think I alluded in the previous question. So I do believe that differential privacy and such really needs to be done, definitely privacy enhancing technology, but most importantly, privacy by design, and expanding that to really do the data protection by design and default. This is an area that I think Anne Kabokchian, she did excellent work in that, introducing this. And I think this is something that organizations should really adopt, in the sense of not just from the perspective of the GDPR and such, but really incorporate fundamental rights, human rights within this data protection by design and default, and making sure that this particular practice is encompassing all those things. That includes whether your training set of the data is really properly representing the group that is a target group that you are going to have, whether it's a proportional or not, whether it's ethical or not. And those should be really done through this data protection and privacy by design and default within your developmental life cycle. Because if you really put that into the practice in one single policy to make sure that your AI, privacy, security, and all of those and the human rights are all incorporated, I think that is going to be a better developmental and better approach in making sure that privacy is, whether it's through AI systems or through non-AI systems, that these are actually built into it. So there are certain things that UAI Act have introduced, which I think is good, that should be incorporated, right? So which is the data should be proportional, whether this is basically your target audience versus your training data set. Are they really appropriately representing your target audience or not? So these kind of things really needs to be built into it to make sure that the system is not biased. And we saw that in the earlier, where certain face recognition or certain cultural recognition was not, the AI system was not being able to recognize it because the training data was biased. And this is something that needs to be on a regular basis, needs to be reviewed, because especially if you are using your data to retrain the system, that means that there is a bias that may continuously get introduced. So something that needs to be really continuously monitored. So I think this is the area that I would focus on in terms of a single policy that organizations should really incorporate into their practice.
Thank you, Imran. And Tahir, your viewpoint on this?
Yeah, I'm in complete alignment with the views already that have been stated. Daniel, definitely from a technology perspective, technology is our friend. Privacy enhancing technology, privacy enhancing computation, differential privacy, federated learning. I'm a big advocate of synthetic data, because then, of course, it's the right kinds of synthetic data that truly cannot be re-identified. So taking the original data set, creating a synthetic data set from that retains all of the value, retains all of the utility, that allows the AI model to make those inferences, but of course removes completely those identifiers. Now, then the conversation will, can it still make inferences? And yes, of course it can. Technology is advancing. So, and then from the training data element, just the challenges that are put on us as privacy practitioners to fast track data pipelines that can be ingested. The challenges of being given a huge spreadsheet or a huge database of data that we have to pre-approve that can be ingested. And of course, the challenges there is one of speed and time. Leadership are saying you have to deploy AI very quickly. Privacy teams now globally are being swamped by having to fast track or pre-approve this. That again is knowledge of the data. Use technology that can identify the critical data elements in real time in your data pipeline, according to your business rules. Implement some form of masking, pseudonymization, anonymization, whatever the actual data privacy team needs, so that the technology can do the heavy lifting for them. That data can then be ingested during the training and tested. The privacy team can then do further checks to ensure that the privacy elements or any kind of risk to that data before it's actually deployed. And then finally, I think we've all highlighted that the importance of ongoing training and awareness. You have all the technology you like, but if you don't understand what the technology is doing, what kind of data is going into it, if you don't understand the differences between harms to privacy and harms to AI and harms as a result of AI. Privacy practitioners, where we look from a privacy lens, AI is much more wider than privacy. It's the actual output that can cause harms to individual groups and society that's much wider than the impact on your privacy rights. So getting that awareness and training across to all stakeholders is very, very important.
So thank you very much to hear, and that's you spot on the bullseye, because the training and awareness is in my opinion as well, is I think the first should be the first foremost important agenda item should be on the leadership table, considering the importance and the relevance of this technology adoption, and of course selecting the right technology in terms of addressing the privacy concerns is pivotal. And on top of it, the back-end processes embedding the data product protection by design in designing these systems and everything is unavoidable now. So thank you so very much, gentlemen. And unfortunately, since we already hit the mark of 1 hour 45, and that's it. This is the most exceptional episode we have done on this show of Technovation with Ahmad Javaid, which is this long, and this is exception only has been done for the heavyweights and the industry thought leaders which we have today. And thank you so much for your time and your experience and knowledge which you have contributed towards the community today. And definitely we would like to hear more from you in the future episodes. And for the audience, and please don't feel bad, because we will not be able to take the questions for you on this live session. If you have any questions on any aspect of or towards directing towards any of the panelists, please leave that question in the comment section within the YouTube channel, and we will respond back to you on that. So with this thing, I'll leave you with the good hands, and for the wishing you the best for the rest of the day. And thank you so very much for my dear friends and the industry thought leaders. Keep contributing, keep up the positive hopes, and definitely all together with the collective wisdom, we one day will be able to make the real decision makers hear about these sensitivities and the right approaches, what we want them to hear about. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, Imran, Daniel. Thank you, audience.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Amazing day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.